Good evening, everyone, and good evening to those of us who are participating via the webcast. It's a real honor to speak to these two gentlemen about the topic of mindfulness at work, and I think this is going to be a terrific conversation. I want to start, Mark, with you. Tom made reference to a near-death experience that you had, a life-threatening accident that really helped set you on this path and this journey to embracing mindfulness and meditation. For the audience, can you explain what happened to you 15 years ago?
Sure. I'll take a step back just half a year or a year before that. My son was in the hospital getting a bone marrow transplant, and thank God he's well today. But he took to Reiki and Craniosacral Therapy while he was actually receiving his new bone marrow on Good Friday, and so I was watching this process, and the Reiki master came over to me and said, "Would you like to get some Reiki?" And I said, "Sure, I'll try it." And I couldn't stand somebody not really touching me, sort of hovering, and it didn't work for me. And I sort of said, I'm glad it's working for Eric, but it's not working for me. And it was about a year after that, Eric, about a year and a half after that, that I had my accident. I was skiing with my daughter. She yelped. I was skiing through the trees. I looked over my shoulder. And the next thing I remember, I was waking up in a hospital bed 7 days later. And I broke my neck in 5 places. And luckily for me, I fell into a river. 60 feet down, I slid into a river. And that cold water froze my spinal cord and prevented it from rupturing. And saved my life. So I have a quadriplegic injury, but I can still walk and talk and move, and but that could have been the result at best had I not fallen into that river. But when I woke up, I was not in pain yet, but within a month I was in incredible neuropathic pain, couldn't think straight, and was on 7 different narcotics at one time. Keppra, Neurontin, fentanyl, Vicodin, Oxycontin, oxycodone, and my favorite, Dilaudid for breakthrough pain. And in spite of all those drugs, I didn't sleep. I was in constant pain. All it made me do was think or care less about the pain I was in, and I viewed that as a real problem, as a quality of life issue. And while I had left the hospital and my neck was healing, to the medical community, I was done. But the result was a letter for long-term disability and more drugs. And I was on the verge of taking my life. I was sitting on the side of the freeway in my car with the engine idling, ready to run into a bridge abutment, when a police officer pulled me over and said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm thinking about driving this car into that bridge." I was in a neck brace and an arm brace, and he goes, "Have you been drinking?" I said, "No, but I am really high." And he got his partner to drive the car home. They took my keys, they took my license, and said, "You shouldn't be driving anymore." Sold the car the next day, and a friend of mine said, "Why don't you try craniosacral therapy?" And I said, "What the heck is that?" And they described it to me, and I said, "So somebody holds onto your head and your sacrum, and somehow you feel better? Really?" And I went for therapy, and after 4 treatments, I started to feel better, and within 6 months I was off all my drugs. And that began a road to recovery. And about halfway through that part of the journey, I couldn't run anymore. I used to run 4 miles, and I was about 230 pounds up from 180. And the craniosacral therapist, who actually is now my wife, Mari, said, "Why don't you do?"
Said it worked.
It worked. She said, "Why don't you do yoga?" And I said, "Oh, yoga's for girls." And she said, "Really?" And so she trained with Desikachar and Krishnamacharya in Madras when she was in college. And so she practiced for 2 weeks with one arm to see if she could punish me in my first meeting. And we did. And within 12 hours, I couldn't move. Got into yoga, said, "Wow, there's something more to this than just the practice." And she said, "Yes, but you need to find that on your own." And I read the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita and this great book by a guy named Leonard Perlmutter called The Heart and Science of Yoga, which connects the yogic tradition to Western religion, which I was a devout Catholic. Tried high school seminary, the nuns had me convinced I could be a priest. And it was in that journey that I found this incredible ability to find my way back to a new me, because you never can recover the old me. And then that kicked into one point where I walked into work one day and said, I think we should all do yoga and mindfulness. And that became a whole process at Aetna that changed our company.
And so 2 follow-up questions. You mentioned being raised Catholic. Prior to your embrace of yoga, had you toyed with other faiths, or had you expressed an interest in Buddhism, Hinduism, anything, did any of those world religions hold an appeal to you?
My teachers were Jesuits. So when, and that's about as close to Buddhism as you get in the Catholic faith. And when I left the Catholic Church, and I was sitting in Boston reading the paper the day the whole story broke on Fall River and everything that went on with the Catholic Church. And so I wrote a letter to the Archbishop in Hartford, who happened to be the guy running Fall River at the time, and said, I get that we have to forgive these men who have sinned, but how could the institutional church put our children in harm's way? And I got a legal letter back. So I left the church, took my scapular off and my cross off, and took the rosary out of my pocket that had been there since I was 11 years old, and said, I've got to find a different way. And that's when I began the search. And this sort of accident happened within that same time frame where when I was coming out of it, this introduction to yoga, reading these books and understanding the science, struck home with me as a way of thinking about life and my relationship to others.
And David, I want to get to your journey and how you found this topic as a journalist, but as a very quick follow-up question for Mark, you walked into Aetna one day and said, I think we should start talking about yoga and mindfulness. How did you, what kind of reception did you get, and what kind of reception did you expect?
Well, of course, I was the president at the time, and everybody was very polite. They said, oh, great, that's a good idea. Wow. And so about an hour after the meeting, our chief medical officer came in and said, I've been sent to talk to you about this issue. Just because you do yoga and meditation doesn't mean we should all do it. Does it really? And I said, well, Lonnie, what does it take for you to believe? He said, this is voodoo medicine you're talking about here. And I said, well, what does it take you to believe? He said, we need to do a double-blind study. And that's how I got the program implemented. Right.
I want to come back to that study and the evolution since then, because the Aetna of today is obviously very different than the Aetna you walked into some 12 years ago. David, how did you come to write the book Mindful Work? What drew you to this as a topic as a journalist and writer?
Yeah, well, my life as a Buddhist practitioner predates my engagement with this topic as a journalist. In college, I had been sort of a teenager who was looking for answers to life's big questions in all the wrong places. And finally, instead of trying to medicate my way to those answers, started reading Eastern texts. I knew I was going to study them in college because I was in a philosophy program. And so one New Year's Eve, I picked up an introductory book on Buddhism, and for the first time, something sort of jumped off the page and made sense to me. Not in that reincarnation suddenly was something I believed in, but the notion that there was sort of a practical way to deal with suffering in this lifetime was really compelling. And so that began a 1.5-year journey just as a college student, started educating myself about Buddhism. I started practicing Zen Buddhism. And then for my junior year of college, I lived in India in monasteries, practicing, studying, and then came back and kind of went on with my life. I continued to practice. I would go on meditation retreats throughout the year, but I was sort of a closet meditator. I ultimately became a business journalist and, again, kept up my practice. But these were two different parts of my life. And then one day, I think it must have been 2013 or so, read a story in the Associated Press that it was one of these brief sort of wire stories. You know them as a journalist, where it's like there's a nugget of information there that sparks your imagination. And it said that in Minnetonka, Minnesota, at General Mills, there was a meditation program. And I literally booked a ticket that day. I said, if there's anyone in the world who's going to figure out like what this is, and if it's something that's real, am I going to recognize it? Is it effective? Is it the same thing I know? It's me. I got to go figure this out. So I went out there, and I was skeptical when I arrived. It was Tuesday. It was 3:30 in the afternoon. I walked into General Mills headquarters, and there were 60 people or so in a room like this, sitting silently. And the woman who was leading this meditation was the deputy general counsel of the company at the time, again, a senior executive at the corporation. And then she started to speak, and she talked about moment-to-moment awareness. She talked about being in the present moment, about not getting lost in thoughts of the past or fantasies about the future. And these were all phrases I recognized because I had heard the very same phrases in India in my practices and retreat centers in the US, and yet something had changed. It was fundamentally secular, what I was hearing. There was no whiff of Buddhism or religion. And so it struck me that something had happened over thousands of years and thousands of miles. This very authentic practice had somehow, over the last few years, been translated into a form that was palatable for corporate America. So I wrote a story about that in the Financial Times. It was cover of the FT Weekend magazine one weekend, and from that very quickly started to work on the book, because I discovered in the process of that story that General Mills was but one of dozens of corporations at the time, which is now hundreds of corporations, that were bringing mindfulness, meditation, yoga into the workplace with varying degrees of sort of intensity and success.
So the number has grown. What else has changed in the 3 years since your book was published? Has the way the practices infiltrated companies changed? What's different today such that we can have a panel here at Asia Society and feel like we can have a definitive conversation about meditation and its benefits for businesses?
Yeah. Well, I'd love to hear Mark's thoughts on this as well, because he is at the very center of the implementation. My answer would be a lot has changed and not a lot has changed. I think what has changed is that there is ever more sort of cultural acceptance of these practices. There is a growing mountain of data, scientific and academic, that points to the efficacy of these programs in reducing stress, in improving physical health, in potentially improving things like productivity, and maybe there are some cost savings associated with some of this. What hasn't changed, unfortunately, is that in most companies, as far as I can tell, the depth of these programs is still quite limited. And by depth, I mean a couple things. I mean the degree to which these practices are actually penetrating the organization is, my sense, with very few exceptions, limited to a small number of employees relative to total employee populations. And I think that's unfortunate and something that I hope companies will work to remedy in the years ahead. And more fundamentally, Mark knows this, when you start to go on meditation retreats, it changes your perspective about life and about some critical issues. Things like equality, things like just economies, things like how we ought to allocate resources and how we ought to take care of people. Really fundamental questions come up when you really start to practice. And my sense is that most companies are using mindfulness, and I'm going to maybe go out on a limb here, in relatively superficial ways. And I say relatively superficial, that's not to diminish the good work that they're doing. That's not to suggest that stress reduction isn't an inherent good in and of itself. But it's the tip of the iceberg. If you start internalizing the lessons of these practices, there's much more fundamental change that companies are going to have to embrace before they're able to call themselves a mindful company.
Mark, I'd love your response to that.
I think back in 2008, when I first brought up this idea, beyond my chief medical officer approaching me about voodoo medicine, my chief of staff and head of communication said, "You're going to get laughed off the stage. Nobody will believe you're credible by offering this." And Bill George had been very outspoken long before a lot of people were.
Bill George, the former CEO of Medtronic and a board member currently of Goldman Sachs.
Right, and Bill got ridiculed for it. But what happened when we started talking about it after we had the data, which was a year in, other companies started saying, "Oh, we do that too." Mark Benioff and Google and all these other companies started to talk about it, and we went one even step further. I mean, Andy Lee's sitting in the back there. He's America's first Fortune 100 chief mindfulness officer. So we brought Andy in because we wanted to create depth in our program and have a relationship not only with our company and with our employees, but with our customers and with our communities that we existed in. Because that's where it leads you. It leads you to community pretty darn quick if you embrace it.
Let me ask the question a little bit more provocatively. Is mindfulness at odds with capitalism?
No.
Okay.
Maybe.
The skeptic. And here's why. When we looked at the results of our study, employees that we measured heart rate variability in our employees to identify stress, and people that were in the highest quintile of stress had $2,500 a year or more healthcare costs. And so when we put them through a 12-week program, those costs, that stress level dropped in half for all those employees. But we thought we got 69 minutes more a month of productivity, and we got $3,000 back in investment. The whole program cost us $197,000. We saved a few lives, and that's where we found the real gold was in the journals that we asked people to keep. And Mari was teaching the class, and Mari and I were just dating back then, and so they didn't know Mari was connected to me. And she'd come home from these sessions and go, "Do you know why these employees have stress off the charts? Do you care? You're a big shot CEO. What are you doing about it?" And she brought home the journals. And I started reading them about, lives, somebody who was going to kill themselves, or, a family that was saved because the employee took it home and the whole family does yoga and sits before meals together and does mindfulness. And as I looked at the cause of it and I read these journals, I was struck by how difficult their lives were. And so I brought in my head of human resources and I said, I want to know who these people are. Tell me who the lowest compensated people in our organization are. Who are they? Where do they live? How do they live? What kind of struggles do they have? And I'd also been hearing this because I go to every cubicle in our buildings when I go to site visits. I shake everybody's hands and talk to them about, we do selfies and we do all that other cool stuff. And I was hearing stories about how difficult it was. They had their kids on Medicaid and families on food stamps. And it took a long time for us to get that data. When any CEO asks me, what's the hardest part? It's getting your organization tuned into the personal lives of the people that work in your building versus what they do when they come to work and when they leave work and what they do while they're at work. And what we found out is that of 5,700 employees making about $12.50 an hour, 81% of them were women. The vast majority of them were single parents. 30% of their kids were on Medicaid because they couldn't afford our dependent coverage, and 20% of the families were on food stamps. And so you look at that and you go, well, how can a successful Fortune 100 company have employees that are being treated like this? So I challenged the team to say, what can we do to help them? And I got the spreadsheet, right? Thank you. I got the spreadsheet, and the spreadsheet said, let's go up 50 cents an hour. And I'm going, 50 cents an hour? That's not even a cup of coffee at Starbucks. What are we going to do to make a difference? And I had to challenge the team, and ultimately my head of human resources, we parted company because I was just not getting the kind of compassion that I needed out of the team. And I had changed as a result of my practice, and I had this wonderful woman I was with who was challenging me to be a better person every day. And the result was that we took minimum wage up to $16 an hour for everybody. And for anybody that was under 300% of the federal poverty level, we wiped out their health care costs. We said, we'll pay for it if you work with us on wellness and on disease management. So for that population, we increased personal disposable income, which was really the idea. I called it walking around money, by up to 35%. And that was huge for these folks. And what that did, more importantly than anything, it got me free hugs in the hallway, which was great, and great letters from families about how they could pay for their kids to go to college. But what then happened is the rest of my team said, oh my gosh, we have permission to take care of each other. And so it's, there's this, David and I were in Seattle last week, and we were talking about mindfulness, and it was Sammy Lee, right?
Yep.
And Sammy Lee was talking about the 4 levels of leadership. The worst level is your employees hate you. Your second level is your employees fear you. The third is you're a natural leader. And the fourth is you're invisible. That the organization leads as a result of your example, but you're invisible. And what we found is, I had employees saying, let's double the tuition assistance. Let's pay back student loans, which we do now for up to $10,000. Let's pay people to sleep. We pay people $300 to sleep 20 nights in a row for 7.5 hours. Let's have pet therapy, which we now have. We said no to mini ponies, but we have pet therapy in our buildings where people line up to see the pets. We now have PTO banks where we donate our extra PTO to employees who are having struggles at home because of a sick child. And so we have all these programs now where the organization said, wow, we can take, and our engagement scores for the whole company went up 1,200 basis points, 1,200%. And it was just a huge, huge shift in the way the company thought about what we did. So that was the value in all of it, is it opened up the heart of the organization to do good things.
Yeah.
You're more skeptical.
I would say that is the exception that proves the rule. And I'm trying to articulate this thought for the first time aloud, so let me see if I can get it right, which is that shareholder capitalism, which is mostly what governs most public companies these days, creates conditions and incentives that make it really hard for the values that get stirred up when people start a mindfulness practice, makes it really hard for those values to find a home, despite what you've heard at Aetna. And that's why at most companies, even if they have a mindfulness program, you still don't see them going beyond sort of the token mindfulness program to really address things like, well, are your lowest paid employees able to earn a living wage and take care of themselves and their families? And those kind of decisions you hear, bump up very quickly against the spreadsheets that human resource officers model, and ultimately against shareholders. I forget if to what extent, if any, you had pushback from shareholders. But you can imagine that if a company that wasn't throwing off tons and tons of money on profits like Google, no one cares if Google gives away free food and runs a meditation program because they spit out cash every quarter. Mm-hmm. But what about that company that isn't so profitable? Do they have permission to also take care of their employees? Or do they have to be a profit center and a huge engine of profit for their shareholders before Wall Street gives them permission to do basic things like take care of their employees and make sure that people can pay their health care costs without going broke? And the truth is, the way capitalism is practiced these days, the answer is usually no.
And I think that is up to the leadership of the organization. So when I met the day I announced, I had 240 million of the 350 million shares at the JP Morgan conference in California. Mm-hmm. In San Francisco, and I didn't get one pushback. I had one shareholder, who was our largest shareholder, say, I'd like you to double my dividend. And I said, I'm not going to do that because I'm going to invest in the company. Well, how about more share buybacks? No, I'm not going to do that because I'm investing in the company. Well, what if your largest shareholder insists that you do that? I said, my largest shareholder should get the hell out of my stock. And she did, all 34 million shares. At $39 a share. She got back in at 109. So she missed the opportunity. And so I think it's a stewardship argument.
Yep.
So I lowered everybody's expectations. So I'm not going to give you 15% every year. I'm going to give you 7%, and I'm going to invest in the business. It's going to grow. It ended up generating 17. But you have to have that. You have to reset the expectations. Because any real good organization has to generate a margin to continue to invest in their mission. And mission-led organizations, whether they're for-profit or not-for-profit, generate margins, put it back into the company. I don't write a check to my shareholders for every dollar I make. They don't get their share of the earnings of the company. It goes back into the company. And what they do is they buy from other shareholders low and hopefully sell higher. That's the share game. And the American public doesn't understand this economic concept, which is a hard thing to explain to people. But in the end analysis, if you manage your shareholder base to the expectations of what you believe the investment priorities and the mission of the organization are, I start every conversation with my shareholders about what our mission is, then they can't argue with me. And if they don't, they can just get the hell out of our stock. They don't need to be in it. And I think that requires leadership that's mission-oriented, wants to invest in their company. And the only difference between a really well-run not-for-profit and a really well for-profit is the for-profit pays taxes. Ask Sister Joyce DeShano at the Sisters at the Ascension Health System. 10% operating margin, bigger than ours.
You mentioned all of the ways that your employees rose to the challenge of taking care of one another once they were essentially empowered to do so. And I wonder, as part of this broader conversation about whether we can see corporations behave themselves in more mindful ways, if a new generation of employees may lead the way. We've seen multiple studies about how the new generation of workers want to work for companies with purpose. They want to have more flexibility. They want to work for a company that has a cause they believe in. And at the same time, we are seeing this greater acceptance in society for meditation practices, for conversations around mindfulness. Do you think that the culture essentially will push companies to behave in ways that reflect a more mindful philosophy?
Maybe a little, but I think it's incumbent on executive leadership and ultimately shareholders to be leading and supportive of these. What we're talking about is like structural changes. And that's hard, and it takes a long time. But I think Mark is exactly right that a big part of it is reminding shareholders exactly what a company's all about and resetting expectations. I'm reminded of Paul Pullman, the CEO of Unilever. He's not a meditator. He's not into mindfulness. And yet if you look at the work that company has done over the last 7 years, it's extraordinary in terms of really owning the sustainability mission and starting to go deep into the organization to try to make changes that are beneficial for all stakeholders up and down all their supply chains across all these products. And what he did was the first thing he did when he took over as CEO of that company is he told his shareholders, I'm no longer issuing short-term guidance. You can stop playing my stock as a day trader, as a hedge fund. Get out. I don't want you here because we've got a long-term mission. And that, guess what? The stock tanked initially because people got out of his stock.
Right. But then the activists came in.
And then the activists came in. And then 3G, sort of a ruthless, I guess you could say, private equity group tried to acquire the company last year. And they've made it through all these threats because he was a leader. He got a board that believed in him, and he ultimately had a shareholder base that appreciated what he was doing in the long run. So that's a model, I think.
And Larry Fink. Fink put a letter out the last 4 years. He's our largest shareholder. He's got a $5 trillion fund. And he said, unless you have a social mission, unless you step in to where our federal and state governments have abrogated their responsibility to their communities, I don't know that we want to invest in you in the long term, and you need to explain to me why I want to be in your company. And the young people coming into our companies now, the millennials, all it's people, planet, then profits. In the conversation. And if you can't describe your mission, people, planet, then profits, they tune out and they go somewhere else. So companies that want to attract the next generation are going to have, and build that kind of leadership model are going to have to start changing their tune.
David, I imagine that you've done a lot of research in Silicon Valley where a lot of these, as you mentioned, Google, and Mark mentioned Mark Benioff. There are a lot of companies in Silicon Valley that not only have mindfulness programs, but whose CEOs talk a lot about mindfulness and meditation. And yet I can't help but notice that Silicon Valley is, a little bit on the ropes right now. How do we square a desire to embrace mindfulness, a desire to embrace purpose with, a culture that has struggled to be inclusive and has struggled to take care of its consumers.
Yeah. My favorite anecdote from this whole conversation that you just referenced is I believe that there were allegations that Travis Kalanick, the disgraced former CEO and founder of Uber, was hijacking the lactation rooms at Uber so he could practice meditation. It's like, you're missing the point, maybe. Here we just have to be reminded that, mindfulness is not a panacea. And just because you might espouse the virtues of mindfulness or practice meditation yourself or have introduced meditation or mindfulness into a company, that does not absolve you of all your sins, unfortunately, if only it were so easy. And that, again, when we hear about these programs, they're sort of getting there's more, they get a disproportionate amount of noise. So again, Google has Search Inside Yourself Leadership Institute, and a lot of engineers, hundreds, maybe probably thousands at this point of Google engineers have gone through this emotional intelligence training that really gets them to sort of communicate with one another better and hopefully take more care with how they treat one another in the office. And yet that doesn't necessarily mean that the executive leadership team of Google have internalized these values and are putting them to work in their strategic planning for the year. That's just not unfortunately, a reality. So, listen, I think, if anything, I would say there's probably a lot of different things going on. It's probably not as simple as there's one way that mindfulness is showing up in the Valley and impacting lives and companies. In fact, I know that's the case. There are companies like Asana, which was founded by two former Facebook employees, early employees there, that has really internalized this into their culture, and they're a very quirky, bizarre company that their stated mission is to sort of reduce meetings in the world, but also, which is a great mission, by the way. I'm all for it.
Me too.
And they've really internalized some of these values. And then, especially at bigger companies, Facebook, I mentioned them as one of the companies who's done this because they have had compassion hack days where they tried to get their engineers to come up with more compassionate iterations. And they actually came up with some useful products that went to combat social, abusive behavior and abusive speech on the site. But guess what? They've got 2 billion people on the site,
right.
And it's not going to fix everything. So keeping in mind, that mindfulness is not a panacea, and most importantly, and Mark can speak to this as well as anyone, it's a personal journey. We're not talking about we have to remember, we're not talking about just a large-scale human resources program that you can instantly scale. We're talking about hundreds or thousands of individual journeys where people start to try to have healthier relationships with themselves, their bodies, their emotions, their thoughts, and ultimately with each other, with their colleagues, with their families. And that is really tough, personal, intimate, individual work that takes a really long time.
Well, that's a great point, the reminder that these are individual practices, yep. And sometimes in as much as certain Supreme Court cases would like us to equate the corporation with the individual, in this particular instance, it is, as you say, hundreds and thousands of individuals needing to find their way, and ultimately, hopefully, getting to a sense of community that Mark talked about. Mark, we're here at the Asia Society, so I thought I would ask you a little bit about the connection of your practice to the cultures from which it came. In one of David's articles, you talked about being drawn to yoga's intellectual and cultural history. I'd be curious to hear a little bit more about what it is about yoga's origins that drew you to it.
Well, the practice I follow is Vinyasa Yoga, and it's the practice that Mari learned from Krishnamacharya when she was in India in the early 80s. And it talks about the 8 limbs of yoga, right? And, the first are the yamas and the niyamas, which are amazingly similar, but 30,000 years before the Ten Commandments. right? And then you have, asana and then pranayama, and then that's all to get you into this ability to sit in meditation for an extended period of time and take the journey. Then you have your 4 levels of meditation, about losing attachment, and ultimately you get to samadhi, something I've got a lot of lifetimes before me before I get there. And I think as I thought about that as a evolution, as an understanding, it came first out of necessity. So my spinal cord injury is a nerve root avulsion at C7, where I have a huge scar. And so I no longer have parasympathetic-sympathetic harmony in my left arm. So my brain thinks my left arm is detached. And so when I get anxious or I get upset, my left arm hurts so bad I can't think. So I had to learn to be Zen, to learn to lose attachment to ideas and thoughts, and expectations in the future and things that had happened in the past, because I was going to be in incredible pain if I didn't. I'm in pain all the time, but it's manageable. But if I didn't get a better sense of my own personal journey and who I was, and so then I began to work with people that actually lived in that world, both practitioners and non-practitioners, to understand what it was like. And Mari's teacher, Gary Kraftsow, he's out in San Francisco. Gary and I spent a lot of time together, and he's totally immersed in that practice. And as I spent time talking to people about it and what their journey was, it always came back to this: it's your own journey. It's your own journey. It's your own journey. And I'm a bit of an introvert anyway, and so having my own journey is a lot more comfortable for me than doing it in groups. And I think so I think it just the whole way it came to me, and the studies I did of it, and the thinking that's behind it, and the oral tradition and the written tradition is all very powerful. I think where we're headed now, for example, with Google AI, and we're doing some work with them around healthcare, there are now ways to actually have a conversation and have somebody have a conversation with other people for you that is very much like human conversation. And it could be conceivable that we would go back to the oral tradition here pretty quickly and never have to write or read another word, which presents all sorts of interesting issues.
Problem for our business.
I was about to say, let's hope that.
Well, my daughter
at least
is
25 years from now, maybe
head of
maybe
tech
30.
and tech and content at the Daily Beast, and she's out at Google talking to them about how can we make this work in the future. And so if you think of the oral tradition and learning that way in community together, like we were in a group in upstate New York just recently for 4 days. A very interesting group with Sharon Salzberg and Joseph Goldstein. It was a very powerful 4 days, but spending that time in group, in community, learning together is an amazing thing. And so that's what drew me to it. I like that feeling.
Slightly different question about Asian culture for you, David. We're in a day and age where I think young people in particular, but certainly a lot of people across a range of ages are sensitive to the notion of cultural appropriation. Westerners have been practicing yoga for hundreds of years, but there's also a trendy quality to a yoga practice. Do you have any thoughts on how people can practice meditation and yoga in a meaningful way while also respecting the origins and the traditions from which it came?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one I think we all need to be sensitive to right now. But I think it's also useful to take a longer view of the journey Buddhism itself has taken over the years. So 2,600 years ago, the historical Buddha theoretically attained enlightenment in northern India, and then Buddhism spread across much of Asia and flourished in all these different iterations and manifestations, and really very distinct traditions cropped up. And so I would just invite us to think about whether that, do we also think of that as well, this is gonna like go viral, and I'm gonna get hate mail on Twitter here. All I'm saying is
Better you than me.
what I'm trying
I'm
to
coming to you next.
Buddhism in America today has a rich and meaningful and deep and authentic life to it. And I think that's a beautiful thing that is very much in line with the spread of Buddhism over 2,500 years now. And I think it's important to respect that and to honor it and to celebrate the fact that Buddhism in America is lively and increasingly diverse and healthy and growing here today. And that the practices at centers like Insight Meditation Society in Barrie and Spirit Rock in the West and the Zen traditions all up and down the West Coast and in New Mexico and the Tibetan traditions all around the country are all experiencing, frankly, a renaissance right now. And that's beautiful to see. At the same time, I have a whole chapter in my book called Mindfulness, because there is what can, the cultural appropriation is one word, mindfulness is another, where people are seizing on the sort of cool factor of some of these practices. And, I'm going to name names here, like Sodexo, the food service company, put mindfulness on the side of one of their vans. And, this is like big processed food, and they're calling it mindful food. It's like, give me a break. It's BS. And so what pisses me off is when I see the appropriation of these terms and iconography without any attempt to actually honor or respect the intentions of the tradition and the practices. What's okay to me is when people embark on a meditation practice or a journey into a practice like yoga and understand what the intention is, which is namely to reduce suffering in themselves and others. And if that's the through line, if that's why people are engaging in it, then I think there's a lot of room for all sorts of manifestations and different looks and flavors, and it can show up in the military or in schools or in business. And I think there's a really wide berth for these practices to evolve and develop right now, so long as that through line of intention is there. And I think we just need to remember, in the Buddhist practice, we're talking about reducing suffering.
I think we're going to go to questions from the audience as well as people online in a few minutes. And I just wanted to give people a sort of 5-minute warning that we're going to be coming to you. But let me ask Mark a question. You've talked a lot about how your practice has changed you. How has it changed your leadership style? How has it changed the way you manage and the way you interact with your direct reports? We've talked a lot about the rank and file that you've helped and that you've elevated. But when it comes to, and we've talked about your shareholders, but when it comes to the boardroom, when it comes to the people that you're directly leading, are you a different kind of leader?
Yeah, I am. I have a preparatory process for my work every day where I get the material for the next day and I review it all and I come to a conclusion based on what I review and I walk into the meeting with that attitude. Now, in the past, it used to be, I wonder how long it's going to take all these people to come to the right answer, to someone in my life who once said to me, why don't you ask a few questions? And see if you can get people to the right place by just asking them questions. And then why don't you listen to the answers and actually develop more questions? You'll be amazed. And where I always used to think I had the right answer, I'm pretty sure that I'm wrong more than 65% of the time, having spent the time. And that, the whole shift, my whole team watched me go through this horrifying recovery. They weren't sure I was going to make it. I wasn't sure I was going to make it. And they were incredibly grateful. As a matter of fact, I had one of my top executives who's always done everything I've ever asked her to do, all the tough work, gave me a book. She took me to lunch 5 weeks after I came back to work and said, here's a book by Khalil Gibran called The Prophet. Why don't you read this? She was, which is devastating to me, she was just diagnosed with adenocarcinoma of the pancreas at a young age, 52 years of age. And she was on conference calls while she's going through treatment. And so I called her up and I said, I have this book somebody gave me. 14 years ago, and I feel like I need to give it back to them. And she said, well, I don't want to fail you. I said, you'll never fail me. I'll carry you if you ever fail me. I would have never said that before. And so the relationship I've now developed with my team is one of, and I think age helps with that, right? I'm now a confessor counselor kind of person because I've got nothing, what more do I need to accomplish other than to leaving good behind me as a result, pay it forward. People always say, well, how do you want to be measured? I want to be measured by impact. I want people to pay for it. I don't want my name on things. So our foundation, Mari and my foundation, is Anahata, which is the heart chakra. And we don't put our name on anything. We don't want our name on anything. We don't want to be remembered for anything. I don't want a legacy. The only thing I want to do is I want people to pay forward what they learned from me that is valuable to others. And I think, and that is a huge shift from where I was before as the golden-haired boy with, a Cornell degree and a brilliant mind in the world by the rear.
David, if you were to write a new foreword for your book or add another chapter before the next reprint, what would you write about? Is there a company that you would want to profile? Is there one that you'd want to go back to? How would you tackle mindfulness at work circa 2018?
In a roundabout way, I did just 3 weeks ago. I had a big piece in the Sunday Times about Patagonia suing the president. And Patagonia, there are no mindfulness classes at the campus. I've been there a bunch of times. No one talks about meditation or mindfulness or Buddhism. And yet, the founder of the company, Yvon Chouinard, Zen practitioner of 70 years, this current CEO of Patagonia and her CEO before that, practicing Buddhists, and Rose Marcario, the current CEO, she's radical. And she's inspired by, you guys featured them as your most innovative company, Cover Story, last month, I believe.
Yep.
She is inspired by her practice in probably, and she'll get at it, but it's not what she leads with. But if you press her on it, she will talk about how she was a very successful private equity executive. She had made a ton of money. She could have made way more by going and taking another big firm. She went to India because she was sort of burned out, and she was practicing. She had a long-time practice. And she was in India for 2 years practicing Buddhism and came back and realized she had something to contribute. She was a leader. She knew how to work in the corporate world. And she sought out a company where she could have maximum social impact. And that company was Patagonia. And they are doing so many things, from suing the president to protect public lands, but more fundamentally and probably more impactfully in the long term, doing things like introducing new regenerative organic standards to the industry and totally radically transforming their supply chain and paying workers all the way down the supply chain living wages. And that's an example. I talked about Yvon briefly in the book, but I think the full manifestation of what a company like Patagonia, which, by the way, is a relatively small company and a private one at that, is capable of when these values get really internalized at the highest levels of the organization, you start to see what can happen.
Yvonne's book, Let My People Go Surfing, is, I have like a stack of them in my office. When people say, well, what do you mean? I go, read this.
Good.
Yeah.
It's the Bible.
It's come full circle.
Yeah.
We have some questions here from the audience online, but I'd like to open it up first of all to questions from people here in the room. We've one in the back. If you could just wait for the mic and identify yourself, please.
Michael Purvis. You talked mostly about U.S. companies with these programs. Are there programs in Europe like this? And if so, how are they different?
Yeah, there are, and I have not done the research to be able to speak with real authority about it. There's an organization called the Potential Project, which is run by a couple very, very smart practitioners that, from what I understand, has meaningful and deep engagements at big companies, including Carlsberg and some banks in the UK. So yes, it's happening, and I don't know enough of the details to sit up here and point to really specific examples. Mark may know.
One of our fellow Sangha members from Staatsburg taught the legislature of Bhutan how to do mindful practice. And as a result of 273 people in Bhutan learning mindfulness, he's now gearing up to teach 10,000 teachers in schools.
Bhutan's already the happiest place on earth.
Right.
I mean,
work with it.
going to get a bit happier. There's a really good question.
And there's a B Corp model in Europe that's coming this way. Europe and it's called the B Corp, and it's responsible, thoughtful, compassionate organizations. They're trying to bring it to the States as a way of applying. I think there's one B Corp here in the United States.
There's a really good question from the email. Daniel asks via email, and we may want a microphone in the back as well. What does a chief mindfulness officer do? Not sure I understand.
Andy?
Should we have Andy explain what he does?
Besides sitting in the corner of my office and sending out good vibes to everybody, seriously, we actually function a lot like other departments in that we put on programs that bring the practice and the benefits of mindfulness to all our employees. And we do it in a way that is as authentic as we can do. It's strictly secular, and we measure our results. We are focused on bringing the maximum benefit to all of our employees. And that can take a lot of different forms. It can be in person, it can be in small groups, it can be in digital programs. So in some ways it's really mundane, but the thing that we're delivering is so powerful, and it really does change people. And the feedback that you get, even from digital programs, is pretty amazing.
Did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I would just add that, Andy, we brought Andy on board when it became impossible for me to respond to all the outside inquiries by other companies about what we were doing. And so Andy's also our ambassador to help other people think about how to institute programs in their organization. And that's a free service that we offer to other companies.
Other questions from the room? Right up here in the front.
Oh, I might not need a microphone. I talk very loud.
Oh, so the people online can hear.
Oh. So I have a comment and then also a question. Of course, Asian society, we and our culture is basically based on Eastern philosophy, meditation, and that's what we've been doing all of our lives. But we're also Shaolin martial artists, and so we believe in action meditation. And so thank you very much for incorporating mindfulness in your corporation. But I would like to kind of be interested in the next step. Would you be interested in something like, I'm not offering, I'm just saying that, would someone be interested in taking it the next step forward to do action meditation, especially with the women, the Me Too movement, because as a woman, I can walk into any room and I'm pretty sure I could kick someone, So
In a compassionate way.
Right, and so I'm thinking if there is some CEO or something would actually take on an action meditation and actually teach that because that's what our master believed, action meditation. Mm-hmm. You don't just sit there and do
I don't know that we've thought about it. Andy, have we considered it?
Well, we have yoga programs, as you know.
We have yoga programs, so asana, but I don't know that we've done martial arts. I know I have some of my executives who do martial arts as a practice.
I'm reminded of the really rich practice of mindfulness in sports in America today. There's a guy named George Mumford who has worked with Phil Jackson, the coach, the basketball coach, and he trained the Bulls and then the Lakers in mindfulness, and has now worked with tons of other sports teams around the NBA, and now there are teams in the NFL and the Major League Baseball that are all incorporating mindfulness in various ways. Again, not to not to convert their players, but to try to get them to be in the present moment when they're on the court or on the field, to not get hung up on that last shot they missed or get too nervous about that next attempt they're going to take, but to actually just stay in the zone, as it were. And if you actually look at what the Warriors have done, I think did you mention this? What their values are? What is it? Compassion, joy.
Compassion, joy. performance.
Something. I mean, but they have embodied, they have internalized some of these values, and they're bringing some of these practices to bear. So I'm reminded that there is a growing intersection of sort of professional sports and mindfulness.
Other questions from the room? Yes, in the back. If you could wait for the mic, please.
Hi, my name is Dan Kayer, and Mark, I was really impressed with your story you told about Aetna in terms of taking a look at what some of the dynamics are that are causing people to suffer. One of the critiques I've heard recently about mindfulness and meditation, a woman wrote this really interesting story about she has had unexplained chronic pain, and her doctors, she felt like she was given this treatment plan to meditate because they didn't know what to do with her, and she felt like she was annoying them, because she had this recurring pain. And so I've also, I've taught some meditation in workplaces, and it's just been, we'll meditate at lunch, and then we'll see how it ripples out. And I guess my question is, what's the next step after people meditate together at an office, in terms of addressing some of the things you did of what's going on with people at home, or, what's the next step after people meditate with their coworkers?
Can I add a one more wrinkle just to make this a even harder question for him? Which is, how do you deal with employees who start to wake up to this and say, great, you want me to be more aware of what's causing me stress? My boss is causing me stress. Your work is causing me stress. The fact that you don't pay me enough is causing me stress. I mean, I think it's all part of that is how do you go deeper and address some of these root causes once you open the door?
So to answer, let me set the stage on this. So my neuropathy, my spinal cord injury, creates intense burning pain from my left fingertips all the way up to my left ear all the time, 24/7, 52 weeks a year. It never stops. I never have a rest from it. I've learned to cope with it, and I was just with my neurosurgeon before I came here because I've got something going on with my avulsion scar on my spinal cord, and we need to take a look at it. And his very first response was, and until we find out what's going on, are you doing the mindfulness twice a day? Now, this is the top neurosurgeon in deep brain stimulation at Mount Sinai Hospital, world-renowned. He's talking about mindfulness to me. So I don't think it's just how do we get rid of somebody. I think it really is an important tool. I 7 narcotics a day, all day long, stoned out of my mind. My pain never stopped. But with mindfulness, I can control it because I have pain. I'm aware of my pain. I am not my pain. That's the way you have to think about it. So, and that actually works in martial arts very well as well as you get a lot of pain in martial arts, but you're not the pain. And so I would argue that for our employees, what we say to them is take this home. And we saw it in the company when employees said, you know what, I've got a coworker whose kid's sick and she's out of PTO and she's got to keep her job. Can I contribute PTO? And then all of a sudden we had a PTO bank. When we had the 3 hurricanes this year, not only did we give money, but we put people on the streets in our employee population to help get families fed. And it wasn't because I said we should do this, it just happened. And so you see the evidence of that in the way people behave, in what they do when people need help, and they demonstrate that compassion. And that's the invisible leader, right? There's somebody else talking to them every day about what they should be doing next. As it relates to the internal stuff, you do give people permission to speak out, and you have to accept it. So, I have a blog, and the employees are very active on it. I get a lot of good feedback, and I get a lot of bad feedback. In the Pulse nightclub shooting, we lost 2 of our own employees in Orlando. That day, I'm a member of the National Gay and Lesbian Chamber of Commerce. I'm their first straight ally. Put the flag up over the building, the gay pride flag. Opened the church's doors across the street so our employees could go pray. The cathedral was more than happy to do that for us. I got hate mail from employees on my blog. How dare you support this heathen and sinful thing? You're going to go to hell. And you have to allow people to express their opinion, and you always respond to them in a polite way. You should be accepting of others. You should be present. We need to be there for people. Because there were people who said these people should be dead in my own employee population. And then I reminded them if they didn't believe that the values of the organization were appropriate, maybe they could find an organization where they were for that.
Pretty bold for someone to write the CEO of their company. And
but you've got to make it a safe place, otherwise you don't learn.
Of course.
Right?
Yeah.
And so you open it up, and I get a lot of direct feedback. I have people come to my office. I want to see you. I have an open door. Sure, come on in. Tell me what the problem is.
Other questions in the room? Yes, right here.
Hi, I'm Katerina N. And I'm wondering, you slightly mentioned it answering the previous question, how the changes in the promotion of the mindful culture actually change the organizational structure of your company, and especially how the new people who are just accepting the new job in the company pursued, and if profile of the people had changed.
Yeah, I think we have, so I have a team here in, we're in New York today, aren't we? Yeah. It's Thursday, it must be New York. And we have a team in Chelsea that are made up of people from Google, from Facebook, from Apple, who have come to work with us to solve a really big problem. And when I talk to those young people, they're machine learning, data geeks. We all get to dress in our skinny jeans and our, funny T-shirts and hang out and talk around big tables where there are no offices. And it's my favorite part of my week is when I get to go hang with them. And I sold them on a mission that says if we solve the healthcare cost problem in America, we've saved the nation's economy. And in virtually every other economy around the world. And we should want to do that. And I've had engineers, machine learning experts who said, you know what, I could get paid more by going literally across the street to Google, but I'd just be selling one more thing. And I don't want to sell stuff anymore. I want to help people. So if you can build that kind of culture inside the organization, it has changed the way we think. It's changed the way we work. It changes the way we set our priorities as a company. We now match up to $9 million a year of our own employee giving. We give $1 million a year of volunteerism as a company. We've started 3,358 new urban farm beds across America on our nickel over the last 4 years because our employees wanted to do that in their communities. So it's really cool. I mean, it's just an amazing thing to watch.
There's a good question from the audience online that kind of relates to that, and I'll start with David, but I'll also ask Mark to address it, which is that we often get the sense, this is Stephen who asks via email, we often get the sense that technology, computers, cell phones, is distractive. Is there any good collaboration between technology and mindfulness training?
Yeah. It's ironic, of course, that we're using apps to meditate now, but we are. The most popular and successful one is called Headspace. We were with Andy, the founder, last week at this event, and it's great. I say, especially for people who are new to the practice, it is like a seamless, fun introduction that can really help you form a daily meditation habit, and they are having tremendous success, including inside companies. They've got a big and growing corporate business. So I highly recommend Headspace, especially as an introduction. If you want to go a bit deeper, 10% Happier, which is founded by a guy named Dan Harris, ABC News anchor. He has worked with Joseph Goldstein, who Mark and I practiced with a few weeks ago, and you get video and audio of Joseph Goldstein, who is one of this culture's most talented and celebrated teachers over the last 50 years in the United States. A real gem, and it's brilliant that he's capturing all that on the 10% Happier app. And then to go even deeper, there's an app called Dharma Seed, which is like a vast, endless library of really just talks about meditation and mindfulness. And many of them are sort of formal Buddhist talks that you would hear at a retreat center. And yet, for anyone who's interested in this, it is the source material. And there's an amazing, amazing, rich catalog from all conceivable teachers on there.
Mark,
I'm on the Mind Life Institute board, which was started by His Holiness so he could learn from scientists about the impact of mindfulness and meditation on the brain and the human condition. And technology is now coming to that group to, how can we chop up 3-hour Dharma talks into 20-minute segments that people can consume and binge on if they want to.
Right. What's the minimum effective dose we can use?
What's the minimum effective dose? How can we chop it up and make it sense for everybody? So I think for a lot of reasons, along with some of the apps that David just mentioned, I think it's a really good tool. I think the best part about technology, particularly our cell phones that we carry around in our pocket, is it's a great way to learn to lose attachment. Right? Try putting it away for a while. And I'm on Ariana's Thrive Global board, and it's all about putting the phone down, getting the screen time away, and so try losing attachment to that thing. And the next time you reach for it, say, you know what, I don't need it. I don't need to know this right now. I don't need to do this right now. And so I use it as part of my personal practice of losing attachment. Do I really need to know that information? Is there anybody that absolutely desperately needs me? That's life and death, and that's how I would think about it.
Candy Crush needs you, Mark.
Candy Crush. I love Candy Crush. Candy Crush is great.
We have time for a couple of more questions. In the back of the room, if you wait for the mic, please.
Hey, this is Ravi Ivuturi. I'm from Citigroup, meditation trainer, Aetna customer, New York Times customer too.
Thank you.
We got to get you to subscribe to Fast Company.
I'll try. Firstly, thanks to both of you for the wonderful work you've been doing in this space. My question is, Mark, you talked about your life experience. You said you got into yoga and then you realized there's something more to it, and then you started your journey. If you look at America's journey too, it seems like the nation has come to a point where we were largely stuck at Ashtanga, the physical yoga, right? And we are at a point where we have made it to the 8th step of Ashtanga yoga, which is, or 7th, dhyana and samadhi. But, in my conversations with people, when they talk about meditation and mindfulness, it seems like they're only thinking brainfulness, if I can call it that. They think the whole idea is to stop thinking, stop thoughts at that point. Right. And I think we need to do something to tell people that there's a lot more to it. How do we take them deeper into samadhi? What's your take on that? How do we address that challenge so that we don't miss this opportunity this time?
Yeah, I always say to people, if you're sitting in complete darkness and you're waiting for something to arrive to inform you on who you are and where you're going, it's a long wait. And that what you have to do is embrace the noisiness of the world you're in and what's going on in your head, give it appropriate reverence, and then let it go. Meditation is about practice of losing attachment. This is, it's in my head. I shouldn't be spending the time. Let it go. Let it go. Let it go. And that's how my practices work for me, is losing. I use meditation, and at times I can go for a long time just getting rid of the things in my head that I've been attached to and try to get rid of 100 times before. And so it's about the progressive elimination of failure, not the search for perfection. That ultimately gets you there. And so that's how I always describe people. Don't wait for something out of the dark to come and inform you about what the world is. Use this. And I use a mantra meditation. I also do loving kindness meditation. Sharon, Mari and I have the opportunity to have Sharon come over to our house every so often and have dinner with us, and Sharon Salzberg, and we do loving kindness meditation. But just this idea of a constant practice of being willing to accept that we're not perfect, that we want to progressively eliminate failure by losing attachment and accepting those things and letting them go, is really important. And so that's how I tend to describe it. David?
Did you use the wonderful word brainfulness? Yeah, I love that word because it's the counterpoint to what I try to always remind people is so important, which is heartfulness. In all honesty, I try to disabuse people of the notion that this is somehow like this antiseptic cerebral exercise. Like when you get into it, it's emotional. It's about love. It's about love for yourself and love for other people. And yeah, you got to do some mental work to get there. But when it starts to arise, it's a feeling. It's not a thought. The feeling that one gets through meditation and practice is the feeling of love, and that's what we're going for. It's not some sort of like empty, cold abyss of space in my brain. That doesn't sound very appealing to me. I'll go with heartfulness, yeah. But it's wonderful that you're teaching at City, and I would encourage you, in as much as it's appropriate, to as your employee base is comfortable, to emphasize that emotional dimension, because I think that's where the real work is.
Other questions? Yes, here in the front.
Thank you for both of you. It's really, really inspiring to be here and to listen to you. My question is, how do you take it on a secular level? Because my understanding and the way I practice it is very much, not on the religious term, but more spiritual and involving God and involving the spiritual parts. So how do you do that? Because obviously it embraces more people that way when you take that element out.
You find opportunities to teach using a secular approach. So in 2009, we missed earnings by $500 million because the economy was coming apart. And I called 40 people together that I thought could solve the problem. I said, I want us all to be in the room. I want all your stuff to stay outside, your computers and your phones. And we're going to manage to our energy, not to the time. And we're going to focus on what matters. And we're going to be present with each other and listen to what each other has to say. All secular, but very much along the lines of, the practice. And one of my senior leaders who practices said, are you starting to bring yoga into the workplace? And I said, no, but the principles are really important. I don't want everybody to be all about yoga, all about mindfulness, but I think we can help and learn from each other. And it took us 2 quarters to fix that when everybody got focused, and everybody had to be there every Sunday from 9 a.m. to 1 o'clock for 10 months, 40 weeks. But we fixed it, and we were together. And then when we got it all fixed, I changed everybody's job. I put all my leaders in different jobs and said, now it's time to look with fresh eyes. And the joy of the journey ahead of you of learning new things. And you can do it. You just have to be careful, because some people will pick up the cues. But I think you can make it very secular. The lessons are profound.
Yeah, I would just add to that. What I saw through my reporting is that thanks in large part to the academic research that's been done over the last 30 years, pioneered, yes, by groups like Mind and Life that may have connections to traditional Buddhists like the Dalai Lama. And Andy knows this full well. I'm sure it's a huge part of what's making his job easier, is that the data is just there. I mean, we can now say with real scientific authority that if you actually start practicing secular mindfulness meditation, your heart rate variability will go down and your cortisol levels will come down. So at sort of a very crude level, like we can just back up basic physiological changes in our major stress markers with it. So for someone who needs that kind of data, that's there. And I think that has eased acceptance in some of these more skeptical settings that might not be ready to sort of take it on faith, as it were.
We're very close to the end of our time. Is there anyone else in the audience who wants to ask a question? I have a few more from online, but we have time for one more from the room. All right. Well, let me go to our online audience. Mark asks via email: should insurers cover matters that fall under this space, yoga, for example, and does Aetna cover them?
We do when employers want it, and I would argue that our work. And this is the compassionate extension of the practice. We are now and have worked with CMS to be able to pay for social determinants of health that otherwise wouldn't be paid for. Food, water, heat. We're now working with Meals on Wheels. It's 2 million volunteers in the home every day, 3 to 5 days a week. It's not about the food, it's about the socialization. And the idea is, can we, with the help of these volunteers, crowdsource social determinants that are now determining 60% of Americans' life expectancy, what goes on where you live, versus 30% for your genetic code and 10% for clinical care, where we spend $3.3 trillion. can we crowdsource this in a way where we can get to the home, and it's cheaper for us to provide transportation, food, water, heating assistance, and a ramp out front of the house than it is for one ER visit in a year. That's what's happened to the healthcare system.
Well, that seems like a whole other conversation that we could
That's
do a panel about.
But that's the result of our people saying we should do more in the community and be in the community with people instead of waiting for them to show up in the system.
Well, this has been an incredibly enlightening conversation and has made me very optimistic about capitalism and the potential for corporations to do right by their employees. And I just want to thank Mark Bertolini, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Aetna, and David Gellis, who's a columnist and feature writer for the New York Times. Thank you both.
Thank you. Sure. Always good to see you.